Hi, my name is Lisa Meltzer-Penn. I'm the immediate past president of the California Writers Club San Francisco Peninsula branch and the current readings coordinator. And we are so excited to be co-sponsoring this panel discussion on inclusion, confusion, and authenticity in writing, and to be partnering with Shuffle Collective to put it on. Also, thank you to California Writers Club statewide organization for helping to fund this program. And thank you to all our wonderful panelists for being here tonight to talk to us about this topic. And thank you to everyone who's here tonight to learn and expand our understanding on this topic as writers and people. And I will turn it over to Shuffle to say a few words.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anuj, and I'm one of the founders of Shuffle Collective. We're also very excited to be hosting this panel tonight. Before we kick off the event, I wanted to tell you all just a little bit about Shuffle Collective for those of you who haven't heard of us. With Shuffle Collective, we're bringing together projects that are shaping and creating culture, whether it's through art, music, literature, or public policy or education. And we give you a platform to develop and share these projects with the world and surround you with everything that your project might need to reach maximum impact, whether it's a community of peers, professional development resources, or live events like this. You can also follow bold and meaningful projects, including from all of the panelists up here tonight. So we highly encourage you to check out the collective. We'll put the link in the chat, and we'd love to help support your project, with whatever stages they're in. And as a special little thing to mark this event, we're gonna offer a special discount to anyone who signs up, who applies before end of day tomorrow. And I'll put the link for that as well in the chat. With that little plug, I'd love to introduce you to our host for the evening, Lizette Wanzer. Lizette is an award-winning author, writing coach, and a writing instructor. Her work appears in over 25 literary journals and books. She's the creator of the forthcoming anthology Trauma, Tresses, and Truth, as well as at a conference of the same name happening on August 7th and 8th. Uh, Lizette is the best, and Lizette, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Anuj. Welcome, everyone. Wow, we have over 100 people here. Excellent. I'm hoping that we're going to have a lively discussion tonight, and we're speaking about a very timely and incredibly important topic. I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing our panelists for this evening. Carla Brundage, if you could just raise your hand or nod your head, or great, thank you. Carla is a Bay Area-based poet, activist, and educator with a passion for social justice. Carla is the editor of the Pacific Raven Press and the founder of West Oakland to West Africa International Poetry Exchange. Mathangi Subramanian, did I say that correctly?
It's actually Mathangi Subramanian.
Mathangi, oh, Subramanian. Is an award-winning writer, author, and educator. A former public school teacher, senior policy analyst for the New York City Council, and assistant VP at Sesame Workshop. Mathangi's work has appeared in the WashingtonPost.com, Ms. Magazine Digital, Zora, Al Jazeera, and many others. Maya Jeffra is a writer, visual artist, dancer, curator, and educator. Maya teaches writing, drama, anti-racist, and cultural studies at Santa Clara University. They're also the founding editor and production designer for queer literary collaborative called Foglifter Press. David Bowles. David's a Mexican-American professor, author, and translator. He's written over 40 books across styles and genres, including several award-winning titles. David's work has also been published in notable publications, including the New York Times and Strange Horizons. David has also worked on several TV and film projects and is the co-founder of the hashtag and activist movement Dignidad Literaria, which has negotiated greater Latinx representation in publishing. So welcome to all of our panelists. So we're going to start by talking about what identity and self-representation means in the context of writing. Gene Roddenberry understood, the Star Trek guy for those of you who don't know, understood the power of representation in film storytelling as a means of reframing attitudes and as a means of upending cultural norms. So what for you does representation mean in literary storytelling, in storytelling for writers? What does representation mean for you?
Well, I mean, my good friend Daniel Jose Older, a writer from Brooklyn, one time when he was asked about diversity and how important it was in representation, he said, "Look, I long for the day when we can just stop saying the word diversity. Representation is about recognizing the real world and peopling your work with the faces that exist in the world around you, and doing so from a vantage point of somebody who is engaged civically and intellectually and emotionally with people from different backgrounds that live in your community. It's about breaking out of the false bubbles that we put ourselves in." And it, I think that's a really great definition, and we've got a long way to go. One of the problems with representation is not just the fact that people are not including that multiplicity of backgrounds and faces and voices in their work, but that it's been going on so long, and it has kind of hedged out people from minoritized groups to the point that in order to get there, we first have to do a lot of heavy lifting to break down the barriers and fill the gaps in the stack of our bookstores and libraries and classrooms. And it's going to take us a long while. It's still, we're in under 5% of books being published every year in the US coming from writers from communities of color, for example, when we make up, moving towards half of the population of this country. And, there's a lot of work to be done, but it isn't, it's work that's got to be done through writing and activism but also through, frankly, pulling down older systems of doing things. And it's like a painful process for like white hegemonic systems of publishing to move past.
Who else wants to get in on that? What does representation mean to you as a storyteller?
I can speak. I think representation can be life-changing. Personally, in my journey, there are markers of stories, such as The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison and Passing by Nella Larson, that spoke directly to my own experience. And those markers, I feel, gave me room and gave me voice. And so this idea of representation and inclusivity, hearing from different voices, is really important, even in the creative process as we grow and learn.
Yeah, I realize that I'm here in my role as moderator, but I must get this in. For myself, the first thing that representation in storytelling means for me is the chance and the safe space to represent ourselves in our own works. Publishers must stop expecting us to be backdrops and window dressings who are embodying roles and supporting roles from central casting. But they also must stop rewarding authors who use our stories and our pain, our struggles and our misunderstandings for their own gain, especially when, one, they're not a part of the communities about which they're writing, and they also have no meaningful or sustained connections within those communities. And in the case of cis white authors, even if they have forged significant ties with the community, they still have to account for and grapple with, as they're creating, their white privilege. when they're writing. And they have to make sure they've done their homework and their research. I think there are a lot of authors out there writing about us, and they haven't done either of those things. Moving on. There's a saying in some literary circles: if all I see is me, I'm not looking far enough. What, if anything, does an author gain by writing about characters outside of their own ethnic or gender identity or their own cultural or even economic experience? What are the payoffs of doing that for the author?
I think just to answer on a more intuitive level with that question, there is the possibility of cultivating an empathy and a perspective that is far and wide reaching. And I think that's one of the goals of being a writer overall, right? I mean, I think a lot of people write to process experiences, not just their own, but what they see. And so when they write across difference, it can really expand their ability to empathize and to cultivate an empathy that, you know, moves well beyond their own experience as well. I think it makes them social agents. Of course, with that in mind, writing doesn't need to be commercialized, right? And I think quite often the sticky moment happens when there is economic gain or some kind of expression of power that happens as a result of the writing that has been done. And that's where it gets into dangerous territory, because kind of like what you said, Lizette, if there's any kind of power taken away or some kind of gain made across that difference, it kind of perpetuates hegemonic structures. And usually the dollar sign is one of the ways that primarily occurs, especially, as David said, in this kind of white, cis, hegemonic publishing structure.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, to kind of dovetail with what Maya's saying, this is one of the issues that Dignidad Literaria had with American Dirt. Almost exactly a year ago, we were in New York City with Macmillan having these conversations around how to pivot away from the problems we had with the book and talk about representation. But the reason the book sparked the controversy wasn't that a woman who wasn't Mexican or Mexican American had decided to write about Mexico and the immigration problem and the border and stuff like that, because that kind of work, as Maya is suggesting, could be beneficial both to that writer who's not from that background and to readers who might find access to those issues through her. The problem was, first of all, she did a really, really poor job. She did not do the work that Lizette is talking about, writers outside the culture needing to do. She would, it's not enough to study from afar. She didn't live in Mexico among these people and for a long time to do that kind of work. It was also because she basically made $3 million before the book even hit shelves. It was just a baldly capitalist adventure that engaged all kinds of actors, from Oprah Winfrey to a host of other people who have a vested interest in certain books being kind of anointed or ordained ahead of time as the book on such a subject that will make a lot of money. And all these mechanisms are in place in these backroom networks to ensure that happens and to reward the people who make it happen. It's no secret that the New York Times bestseller lists is completely manufactured by publishers and popular booksellers and publishing firms and so forth. It's a really, really icky situation. And of course, there are people who will say, well, that seems really greedy of people of color, to be complaining about the fact that other people are making money. Write a better book. None of this has to do with quality. There were markedly better books about the immigrant experience written by Latinas, for example, none of whom got even close to $100,000 as an advance, most of them under 50, most of them under 20, frankly. And that kind of economic disparity, that kind of using the story of a people to make money rather than as a part of allyship, or I can imagine a different scenario where Jeanette what's her last name? I can't think of it right now.
Cummings. Jeanette Cummings. Jean
Yeah.
Cummings. Yeah.
No, it's Jeanette. It's Janine. Janine. Thank you. Yes, Janine. I always get the first name wrong. Janine Cummins had said, this is really important. Let me write a series of like blog entries, or let me do a journalistic series, or let me write a book and self-publish it, or put it out through a small press. And like if she were investing in the community, or if she had said, okay, I got $3 million and I'm going to invest half of it in that community. I mean, it's something along those lines, but there was nothing like that. Nothing of any significance. I mean, she did donate some money to charity.
David, can I just cut in here for a second?
Of course, yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
So the flip side of that is also that when people like us who come from these backgrounds, like David was saying, try to write books that do represent our reality and the diversity of our reality, we don't necessarily get the chance to even publish them, let alone benefit from them, monetarily. So my latest book actually has a very diverse cast of characters, including queer and trans characters that are outside of my experience in terms of my sexuality, but very close to my experience in terms of my race and ethnicity. And the book did really well. I didn't make a ton of money, but critically it did fine. But then I wasn't able to sell a book after that because the characters in it were not relatable, right? But the characters were very much part of my representation, and part of my own experience. So, what dovetailing on what David and Maya are saying, who gets to decide what is relatable? Who gets to decide what is representation? And quite frankly, like if I had to suffer through a separate piece when I was in high school, like other people can read stories that they're not familiar with and characters that they're not familiar with. And like I had never hung out with like the white boys who were in what's it called? J.D. Salinger's book. I don't know why I'm blanking on it.
Catcher in the Rye.
Catcher in the Rye, right? I had never been to New York City when I read that book, but I was expected as a teenager to relate to that when I was the first generation daughter of immigrants who was like editing my parents' English when I was 12, right? So who's to say what's relatable and what's not, and what's marketable and what's not? The frustrating thing for me is when I see, first of all, in the rare instance when I see my culture represented, it's not accurate often because it's what publishers think my culture and South Asian culture is. Second of all, whenever I get a book deal, the first thing I think about is, well, I'm the South Asian title they're publishing. So how many of my friends didn't get book deals because I got this book deal, right? So to see something like American Dirt do well is so frustrating because there's so many of us who have worked so hard to accurately represent characters that are within our experience, although maybe not the same identities as us. And we've done the work, and yet somehow our books are not marketable in this weird capitalist game of selling art, which also doesn't make any sense fundamentally.
I'm seeing some pretty interesting questions here. I'm going to pick one of these because I think we can have some pretty good conversation around this one. This one, which is also related to another good one that was asked a bit earlier. Why castigate successful authors rather than work to get better advances for others? And I have a question sort of dovetailing on that, which is, how can we work harder to make sure that we're part of the backroom conversations that David was mentioning?
I mean, obviously, the problem with that stance is castigating authors for their high advances is actually castigating the system that decides that one author per year deserves to get $3 million, and that writer is typically white, and then a host of other writers don't deserve that. Bestsellers are made, they're manufactured. It's about the PR dollars that are invested. If you put 5 copies of a particular book in every single bookstore in the continental United States, that book is going to be a bestseller. I mean, and that's a decision that's made behind closed doors between publishers and books, and like big chains like Amazon and Barnes and Noble, stuff like that. These things are manufactured. Now, they choose titles that are similar to titles they've published in the past, that meet certain criteria that they feel are going to get a certain type of buzz, and so they perpetuate a particular kind of voice to kind of echo what Matthew was saying right now, and that is and this voice becomes the underpinning of the national intellectual and artistic conversation, and it's a voice that up until very recently was completely just white, and anybody who's coming from a tradition that's different and has a particular voice or writing style or story structure that doesn't ape the conventions that have just become homogenous and normalized in this country, is going to have editors and agents and so forth saying, well, I can't connect to this voice because they themselves are part of the system that perpetuates the pablum that is fed to the American public. And it's a pablum that erases, elides, other voices. We think about like the rise of white supremacy and white nationalism in this country. I mean, it's always been there, but like the openness of it, the like in your faceness of it in the past decade or so. When children go to school and they read literature in which the mainly white faces are reflected, and they only are reading, whether they are white children or children from communities of color, they're only reading books in which white children are represented. It's understandable two things will occur. Children from communities of color will begin to see themselves as unworthy of being part of that literary conversation and being on that national stage. And children who are white will begin to unconsciously see themselves as the default, and to see others as invisible, to not see them at all, frankly.
All right, let me jump in here. This is another really good question I'm seeing here. It says, can you really blame the author, this is Janine Cummins, for getting a huge advance from American Dirt when that was the decision of the publisher? And so shouldn't our outrage be aimed at the publisher rather than the author? Who wants to take that?
Well, yeah, I think it's aimed at the publisher, but it's also aimed at the author because she didn't do the work, Like in my last book, I have trans characters and I have queer characters, and I'm not trans or queer, but I interviewed people who were trans, I interviewed people who were queer, I read life stories, I did activism with people from those communities to try to understand them. I did a lot of, what David was talking about in terms of reciprocity, and now on the other side of it, I'm not Jhumpa Lahiri, but at least I'm someone who, if a South Asian author needs an agent's email, I can give them an agent's email. You know what I mean? So my problem with Cummings is not that she got a huge advance, is that I see authors all the time who are doing the work, who are mentoring their communities, and are getting $17,000 for a much better book, right? Which is partly the publisher's fault, but it's partly also like, if you have a platform, you have a responsibility, particularly if your voice is one that's not often heard, I think.
Maya, I see your hand up.
Yeah, because this is not merely an issue of just, the white perspective. It's also the issue of these people in these positions of power making the choices also have very narrow views of what they consider to be the perspectives of a Black character, a trans character. And it's, they might be celebrating writers outside of, just the white default, but they're still using this very kind of narrow perception of what they think would constitute a successful representation of any of these other characters. I mean, I can't tell you how kind of disheartening it was, growing up queer, and the representations that were being green-lighted were AIDS patients, hustlers, drug addicts, and stylish confidants of lovelorn women. I mean, that was it. And it's like, and everything had to fit that mold, and it still does. It's interesting how many times I've been even told by an agent or a publisher, like, oh, your character, I don't know if it's going to connect with audiences. I don't, it's just rubbing a little too much against a grain of some kind. And
Yes.
that is very dangerous because, kind of like what Matangi was saying earlier, it narrows the perspective of how culture views that entire group of people as well.
And I run into that buzzsaw all the time. Carla, did you want to weigh in on this?
I think this particular piece, I'm going to pass on this one.
Okay. Anybody want to weigh in on this further? I could weigh in, but don't get me started because
Well, I mean,
it makes me hugely enraged, and I can't tell you how many times I've sent something out only to get notes back saying, oh, we read your story, but then we looked at your LinkedIn and we didn't realize you were African American. Is there something you can do in the story to make it clear that these are, I see David.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the whole, either the own voices work that I do. I've either gotten, this is too Mexican American or this is not Mexican American enough, right? So, somebody, somebody put a long message in the chat, and I just caught the end of it, and about this idea of being, an author being able to write, whoever they want to write. And I want to make it clear, and Lisette, you essentially said the same thing at the beginning, and I doubt that anybody on this panel disagrees with me. Writers can write outside of their experience. It is when I try to think of what I would feel like if all I could ever write was a light-skinned pan bisexual Chicano, and every single one of my protagonists had to be that. I mean, there's a lot I could do with that, but I don't. There are times when I want to write stories that are not quite that. I mean, darker skinned Latinx people, or an indigenous person from the past that represents some of my family's indigenous heritage or whatever. And sometimes, frankly, writing completely out of my lane. I don't do that very often, but sometimes I do. And I love the story that Debbie Reese, who is a scholar of children's literature, a Nambe Pueblo scholar of children's literature, tells in some speeches that she gives about illustrator James Ransom. He was asked one time, you do such beautiful books, why don't you do a book about Native children or about Native things? And he said, because I've never held their children. And to me, that's really key. There are plenty of opportunities in allyship and in coexistence for you to become so entangled in the lives of people who are different from you, that they trust you to that point that they will put their babies in your arms because they know that, as we say in Spanish, that you're gente, that you're part of the people, and that they can trust you. And when you get to that point, there's a possibility that you can write about them in ways that are going to be respectful and that are going to be informed by deep and long-standing relationships with people in that community.
Yeah, I was going to say that I was connecting some of the things David was bringing in, all the other panelists. And I think I'm going to just throw out a whole different point of view here. As a mixed race Black woman who's lived in Africa for a long time, I find myself self-censoring, am I authentically this enough to write about it? Am I authentically that enough to write about it? And I find myself questioning myself to the point that I freeze, I don't publish anything because I'm so afraid of the judgment of the would-be audience. That being said, at the same time, I also believe that there is a way that when people take a voice that's not theirs, and the one I'm thinking of mostly is the help, it can damage. And so that damage, I think, is so heartfelt that I can self-center myself out of the market. And so when I see other people boldly take those creative steps, I'm always kind of thinking like, wow. And then it does tend to be people who have privilege already, whether it's, in those different areas of privilege. And so I feel that that's something that's worth thinking about as writers, is where do we self-censor, and then what gives other people the voice that we might be holding back. And I do think that that's where it connects to the money and the bestsellers list and who's validated and who's not validated.
Yeah, I mean, I personally do not want to self-censor. And if that means that I make less money because I don't want to be a sellout, then so be it. I don't want, I had this one experience where I wrote a short story in the Black vernacular. And I sent it out, they accepted it, this journal, but when they sent me back the galleys with the edits, some editor had gone through and corrected every single piece of Ebonics to proper English, every single piece. And after the first page, I was like, okay, well, it's going to take them a page or two to catch on. But they went and did that throughout the entire manuscript. And I was livid, I was furious. And I called the head editor and I said, what's going on here? And their response was, oh, that editor probably needs more training. But that ticks me off, as well as italicizing words from other languages and text and similars.
My book has 4 languages in it, and the italicizing thing was something that I just eventually gave up on, because they were like, no one is going to recognize us. And I was like, this is how every South Indian family I know speaks. Like, we all mix like 4 or 5 languages, and there are a billion of us. So, maybe a few people actually do speak like this, but sorry, Lizette, I didn't realize it was
That's okay.
Everyone could hear me laughing, but I'll put myself on mute.
No problem. Let's see, I saw a really good question in here that I wanted to get in. Darn it. Okay. So someone has put here in the comment, there's research on one side of this process or equation, I would say, but also the issue of sensitivity. What about that? There's research and then there's also sensitivity. What about someone like Susan Straight?
So I actually used to be a sensitivity reader, so I can start off the discussion if you want. So I actually, as part of my research, I always have beta readers for my work. And my beta readers are not authors. They're like my friends who are Muslim or trans or whatever. But, I stopped being a sensitivity reader because I feel like there's this whole sort of movement among certain authors to see sensitivity readers as just to give themselves permission to write certain characters. And what I was encountering more than anything in sensitivity reads was that I didn't see a real reason to have a diverse character in. They were just sort of thrown in just because somebody, and maybe it was somebody well-intentioned who just wanted to put somebody in. But like for me, I write, my characters are women and South Asian because I am a South Asian woman. Mm-hmm. And so those are the stories that come out, and those are the stories that I want to tell. So I don't feel like I have to justify those choices. I think what Carla was saying was interesting because I'm also, I'm like high caste. And so when I write a low caste character, even though technically our identities are similar, I have to think a lot about my privilege. So even like within our identities, we have to confront that. Mm-hmm. But I think if you're just writing a character who is outside of your experience for money or just for the sake of it, it usually doesn't, it's usually not done with sensitivity or with, I hate the word authenticity, but it just doesn't read honestly. Because, you know, even when I'm making certain choices about my South Asian characters, right? Even on a basic level, like beyond identity, like if I have a character who's athletic, there's like a reason for that in the story, right? So if you're just going to throw a black or a brown character in there or an immigrant character in there to be the sidekick, then it's just not going to read true. But if you're throwing them in because there's some plot that has to do with immigration, then that sort of makes more sense to me.
Yeah, but too often we're thrown in there as central casting, supporting, or backdrop people. I had a question for you though. Why do you hate the word authenticity, or why are you not fond of it?
Because yeah, I'm a South Asian immigrant, and so there's always this question of whether I'm like brown enough or immigrant enough, and so authenticity has definitely been weaponized in my particular community. And I write a lot about caste and privilege, and I get a lot of hate mail about not being authentic. And so the word has sort of been poisoned for me a little bit. Because there's also, you know, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but within my community, like I'm definitely not brown enough because I'm not religious enough, or I'm, you know, I don't believe that I believe that casteism should no longer exist, and that makes me a traitor. So like there's politics sort of within communities as well, and I sometimes feel like authenticity is used to keep people out of their own communities.
Yeah, it's like I always say, there are as many ways of being Mexican American as there are Mexican Americans, and I often get into debates online. I get really tired of them about the term Latinx, for example, or Latinx, as some people say in English, because there are plenty of Mexican Americans and other people of Latin American descent that despise the word, frankly, because there's a lot of queer media in our community. And so, you know, having grown up as a pansexual, you know, queer Chicano on the border, you know, I experienced a lot of that nonsense myself as a kid, as a teenager. And as a young adult, and I don't have a lot of patience for it. So people outside of the community, maybe, you know, I don't talk about it too much to them, but, you know, authenticity also rubs me the wrong way, because, you know, and that's one of the reasons as and I totally agree with the idea of sometimes even bringing in cultural experts, sensitivity readers, if you will, from your own community, because you're writing like multiplicity of voices, and you just want like another set of, in my case, Chicanx eyes on what you're writing, just to give you feedback, just to, maybe you've not seen something that they'll see at the end of the day.
Who else has served as a sensitivity reader?
I have
David,
a bunch.
you have?
Yeah.
Is there anybody here who refuses to serve as a sensitivity reader?
I do now, because I was one. So now I refuse.
I refuse. I did have one author who asked me to read an early draft of her manuscript. And there was a scene in her book between a white protagonist and an African-American nurse in a hospital. So already, you know, we have the central casting character in there. But in the dialogue, she had written that the nurse responded to so-and-so in a soft Black voice. And I wrote on her, the facial expressions, I wrote on her manuscript, I said, you know, what is that? What kind of voice is this? I've never heard a soft Black voice. And her response was that, well, African-Americans tend to have lower voices. And I said, well, while that's not always the case, but if that is what you meant, it's your job to transmit in the narrative a less preposterous way of delivering that. I mean, because what's next? A soft bisexual voice, a soft Native American voice, a soft trans voice? I mean, if you're going to feature a Chicana or a Latina character, what voice will you give them? A soft accented voice, when we all know very well that not every brown voice is accented, and those that are don't have all identical accents. When I lived in Atlanta for 6 years, when I first moved there, I'm a native New Yorker, all Southern accents sounded alike to me. But after living there for a while, I could actually tell which part of the state people were from. Were they from the deep South or the mid South? Were they country or city? the UK, there's a wide variety of accents that divulge the same kind of information. So kind of leading up to the question that Melody Fuller has asked here, which is, how can you write about class differences within memoir and nonfiction with, she's asking specifically about African-American people. I'm asking in general. She does say that she's class fluid, raised upper middle class, and upper class African-Americans want perfect pages. Does that make sense? To me, Melody, it does. And we could spend the whole evening speaking just about that. I've been told when I've spoken with publishers on the phone, they're like, oh, well, we got into your story or we looked at you online and we thought you were white. So I see the eye rolling, but it happens a lot. It still happens. It's very annoying, also kind of painful. So does anyone want to speak to that? Maya, you look like you're dying to speak.
Oh no, instead of speaking to it personally, I think that a really good example of nonfiction that explores kind of the dialectics and also the complexity of this is Eula Biss's Notes from No Man's Land. And Eula Biss is a white middle-class writer, professor at Northwestern, and writes about class and race in this really fascinating intersection, and does so with grace and a sense of curiosity and dignity. So instead of me waxing about any kind of wisdom I would have about it, consult with Eula, because she did it really damn well, and it's a great book.
I think I was going to say earlier, I saw another question about writing about Native American people, but I think it connects a little bit to Melody's question as well, is that a certain amount of awareness about just the times we live in is always important. So I know the Native American, it's in those questions that are coming up. In the Indigenous and Native American community, they actually passed an act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, like, please do not steal our culture. We've been stolen from too much. Like, there's a stand that has been taken by the community. So if people are writing about Native American people are not like aware of how the community feels about cultural appropriation, then that's a flaw. That's a flaw on the part of the author, and the author should be willing to take responsibility for that. And connecting to Melody's question, again, in the African-American community, at least my mom's Jack and Jill family in Tuskegee, Alabama, this idea of presenting the perfect image is really important because we've been so pathologized. So I think it's fair. I don't believe in self-censorship, but I feel that knowing who you are and where your community stands is like just going to make it a better book if you're willing to take the heat. And I'm kind of talking to myself because I haven't been willing to take the heat, but I do believe that those places come from a really real place.
Yeah, and just for members of our audience that aren't familiar with Jack and Jill, it's an upper crust African-American organization. You generally have to be fairly moneyed to be in that organization. We also have others. There's the Girlfriends, the Links. There are a number. And characters, if you're writing characters from that realm, publishers are definitely going to be disappointed because they don't fit the stereotypes. So I'm going to ask, do you know any writers, I'm going to say cis white writers who are doing an excellent job of representing the other in their work?
So I'll take a chance here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought when Sue Monk Kidd wrote The Secret Life of Bees,
Mm.
I tried to figure out like, who is this person and where are they coming from? And it wasn't totally a story about the other, but I felt like the success in that book, for me personally, I did like that book, came from the fact that she blended her personal experience as a Southern white woman with writing this other story that she was trying to tell. And so that's when I feel it works. And again, the elements of the help that did work came from that same way of like where, and I know the help is very controversial, so I know I'm opening up a big can of worms here, but I'm saying when the person actually stands in their own flawed identity and tries to like build some sort of a bridge, I feel like that's a little more interesting than just writing about the other.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree with that. I also loved that book. What about across economic and gender identity strata? Who's an
So
author
I
who
was
does that
actually,
really well? Yes.
I was actually going to say, this is flipping the question a little bit, but Alana Masad is a non-binary writer, and their book, All My Mother's Lovers, looks at whiteness in a way that I've never seen before. And so the characters of color in the book just feel, I don't know, they feel better to me just because the narrator, who is white, is reflective about, the narrators are reflective about her whiteness. And so somehow, because the character, because you often read books about white characters where their race is not named because they're just assumed to like be the default.
Right.
But in this book, whiteness and sexuality are both very intertwined, and class is intertwined. So I just thought their book was a really good way to sort of move away from the default cis hetero white middle class norm. And I'll put the name in the chat. It's
That
a
would
really
be
it's a really
great.
great book. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I write mainly books for children and teens, the name that pops into my head right away is Joe Hayes. Joe, he's in his 70s now, and he's written like tons and tons of books for children and teens, and mainly books that are centered on Mexican American border traditions, because he grew up his entire life in the Mexican American community in a small town in New Mexico, and he speaks Spanish beautifully and writes in Spanish beautifully, and he is definitely white, and his entire family for generations has been white, and he can tap into those traditions as well. But he just does an incredible job of retelling folk tales and so forth, and writing in English and in Spanish. And his books are widely read in schools along the border, where there's a really high percentage of Mexican American students, and they respond really well to them. The books are used on a lot of really successful literacy programs, and that's the kind of person that, to go back to Debbie Reese's comment, that the Mexican American community will allow this man to hold their babies, and so he does a really convincing job. So there are people who do it.
Okay. Any other nominations for authors who do an excellent job of this? Not a lot out there, I know. I can't wait till we get to the Q&A. There are like excellent questions coming in. So New York Times book critic Parul Segal said that about American Dirt. His description was, what thin creations these characters are. So you don't need to have a dog in the American Dirt fight to answer this, but how do you determine personally when an author has crossed the line between incorporating necessary identifiable cultural elements and stereotyping or tokenism or cultural appropriation? So how do you determine when that line has been crossed for you?
So I actually more often experience the opposite. And I think it's because I write for teens also, and I review a lot of books for teens. I often read books where there is a sidekick who is like South Asian or Black or Latinx, And they're basically a white person who like eats chicken curry for dinner,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So like, like, you know what I mean? Like, because when I'm writing about my family, there are things that I put in, or a family like mine, there are things I put in sort of subconsciously, like the code switching between languages, right? Or a certain attitude my mother will have that I know many other South Asian mothers have that just feels, so the character feels three-dimensional. I often have the issue where I feel like a character is just sort of, you know, like Lizette, you talked about central casting.
Yes.
It's like when Emma Stone plays an Asian character. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not quite right.
Right. Yep. It doesn't ring true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it basically just boils down to, you know, when a character is essentialized, you know, they're almost like just decorated
Yep.
with kind of cultural monikers.
Yep.
We feel that. I mean, it's hard to identify a line, but you definitely can see essentialization and exoticization if you want to look at it from the positive spin. And I put that in air quotes because it's just as dangerous as denigration of a culture. But no matter what, it feels, if there's any way to really describe it, it feels like ornaments on a Christmas tree. Instead of this kind of, as Matangi had mentioned, you know, this kind of fleshed out character that happens to also, you know, have these kind of identifiable cultural monikers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the trick, right? When you're reading it, because you can notice this about protagonists that are not from your background, but that are not white. I mean, if you, I always, that's the, I guess like the trick or the test is, if I change their name to like Jane Smith or Bob Brown, is the character untouched? Is the character unchanged? If I swap the curry chicken for Kentucky Fried Chicken, is it gonna be the same thing? And if so, then that writer has not done their due diligence and is not really representing those characters, and maybe needs to spend some time. I mean, I think that one of the biggest problems that we really haven't like gotten at, although Carla kind of like hinted at this with her own sense of like self-censure. Going back to my friend Daniel Jose Older, because he always writes great stuff. He's got this great article on writing the other and the self. And I think that people who are so urgently wanting to write other cultures and like are demanding and quoting people and saying, I should have the right to write these other cultures. The question that I'll ask themselves is, can I write myself? And have I turned the spotlight of critical analysis on myself? Have I explored myself and written about that and gone into all these nooks and crannies and crevices of my soul to the point that I understand what it is to be a human being from the inside out in a writerly way? Because until you do that, you can't freaking write about other cultures. What the hell are you doing? No. Do you understand all of the ups and downs of your own culture and your own place in it and your rootedness and geography and heritage and culture? Or have you bought into, because of your reading through your entire life, this homogenous, you know, white hegemony that actually doesn't exist? It's completely constructed and has no real correspondence to the way people genuinely live their lives. This is one of the things that I tell white writers in workshops is, quit writing about like the white experience, because that shit doesn't exist. It's manufactured to retain power. Write about you, write about your rootedness in the place where you live. You know, I had a student one time who wanted to write a teen fantasy series set in New Jersey, in the town that this person is from, but they basically read like Harry Potter. I'm like, this is not New Jersey. This is your imitation of British fantasy. What does a magical school in New Jersey look like? It needs to feel like New Jersey.
Mm-hmm. So yes, Maya.
I also I want to bring in you know, this experience. I have a book coming out in April, and it's called The Violence Almanac, and it is a portrait of violence in California. And one of my goals was to capture the California landscape. And there was no way that I could write about the California social landscape without having lots of characters that are outside of my own identity. And I felt like I would be doing a disservice if I was to write a series of characters that were, because that's not representing California. So I had this kind of ethical conundrum, like, what do I do? You know, in order to, for lack of a better term, authentically represent California as a portrait. Oh, wow, look at that. Thanks, Mati. I didn't ask her to plug that. But I had to ask myself, okay, if I'm going to try to accurately represent California, then I'm going to have to write across difference. I have Black female characters. I have Latina trans characters. I even have some of them in lead roles in the collection of short stories. And I spent so much time performing ethnographic interviews, communicating with people, entering into communities. But then ultimately what David is kind of talking about is understanding myself in relationship to those communities, understanding where my privilege enters in, where I might be exacting the white default, which of course I'm going to do, and shutting that shit down as soon as I could so that I could have open eyes and write with that sense of empathy and also understanding, knowing that I wasn't going to get it exactly right, but knowing that I had a commitment to do it. And is it dangerous? Yes. But I just wanted, because I'm seeing a lot of these comments in the chat where people seem like they're upset that we're talking about how problematic it is to represent. Yes, it is. It doesn't mean that it can't be done, but you have to work your ass off to ensure that you're not bringing your own sense of hegemonic supremacy into the language. You can do it, but you got to work.
So I also have noticed that theme coming up in the comments. And so we know that there are writers out there who are genuinely endeavoring to do a good, credible job of incorporating representation in their work. Writers who do want to honor and respect, they don't want to irritate, they don't want to uplift or showcase ignorance. So imagine that you are an author seeking to do this yourself. And some of you have. Maya's just described his upcoming book. What strategies would you suggest employing to ensure that you're doing a good job depicting others' experiences in an authentic way? How would you go about, for example, educating yourself on systemic issues, or even economic issues, or class issues? What can you do other than just having, a friendship group in the other to educate yourself? Other than just having beta readers from different backgrounds. And I would suggest, think about an audience of that demographic reading your work. That would be one of my suggestions. But I think you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to talk briefly because I think I mentioned this a little bit before, but my last book, I did 3 years of in-depth ethnographic research where I was going into slums every single day. And I was actually doing this for an academic project, and it then became 2 novels. I did interviews with people from the groups that I was working with. I read about probably 30 books of life stories from different people, different characters' perspectives. I had beta readers, as Lisette mentioned, and I also, I only sort of wrote about groups where I had formed strong friendships and relationships. So I had friends who lived in slums who were queer and who were trans, and because I was part of their communities, I felt comfortable writing about it. Now, I now have a 5-year-old and no childcare during a pandemic, so I can't go do like a 3-year ethnographic research project every time I want to write a book. But I do think that it's important to think about how to do research in creative ways, and that if you're a fiction writer, you have to do just as much research as if you're writing a work of nonfiction. As someone who's written both, I think it looks different for different people, but you have to do the work.
Maya, I'm wondering for our audience if you can just give a a nutshell description of what ethnographic reflexive research is?
Sure. And, you know, because I saw Lynn's comment. Where, you know, she's like, stop bitching and give us some insight. So I would like to be able to help in that in regard. Oh, my apologies. The ethnographic research is born out of anthropology, which has lots of problems, right? And especially in representation on an academic level. But around the 1940s and 50s, there was this movement to incorporate what we call reflexive ethnographic research. And it's kind of inspired by Victor Turner's work. And then had Bell Hooks does quite a bit of it as well, who is my hero. And even on a creative level, Anna Devere Smith, who people might know from like Twilight Los Angeles and more like theater work. But it's this idea that you are doing deep research into a culture that is not your own, usually incorporating lots of interview processes as well. But you also are consistently reflecting not only on the information that the interview subjects and the culture is providing you, but you're also constantly meditating on how you're interpreting that information, the way you are reading the information that they provide in the interviews, and reflecting on where you might be misinterpreting based on your own circumstance, your own perspective, and then highlighting wherever you think that your blind spots occur. And you meditate on those and you try to chisel away at them so that you get to something that might be more in line with the accuracy that's being presented to you and the research that's being provided. You know, this is in a nutshell, and I'm really sorry if that's not very articulate, but I did put in the chat, there is a really good beginning ethnographic text that's very accessible called Shane the Lone Ethnographer. And I think it does a great job at, especially for writers or anyone doing creative expressions, to utilize these reflexive processes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that comes to mind that's like a super easy way into this, and maybe even a tool for getting you to reflect on whether you're the right person to tell a story is read. So, you know, I think of like Janine Cummins. Janine Cummins she proposes to herself she's going to write about immigration issues in Mexico, whatever. Read lots and lots of books by Mexicans, not just about immigration issues, but, you know, all kinds of books, so that you can get a feel for the language, the culture, the different class dynamics and the different racial dynamics. And there's so much colorism in Mexico. And you know, I live part of the year in Mexico. My wife's from Mexico. My great grandparents from Mexico. And it's a complex society, and I have read books by Mexican authors my entire life. And so when I set out to write about a character in Mexico, I've got like a frame of reference that comes, you know, from my own life and from reading as well. And for this space opera series that I was talking about, called The Path, the first book, The Blue Spangled Blue, each book is on a different planet. And this particular planet, 700 years in the future, is peopled by immigrants from the asteroid belt, who themselves were descendants of African and Indigenous American and Southeast Asian workers, miners who went to the belt. And so the culture and the language and all these things that I created and projected 700 years in the future, I literally have spent 25 years writing the book. I created the language. I thought about all these different the different cultures that were coming together and how they would weave together. I studied Zulu and Swahili and Xhosa and Nahuatl and Yucateco, which is a Maya language. I studied Sanskrit. I studied Korean and Japanese. I did all this work because I'm trying to write a book about the future of humanity and a path forward. In order to do that, like, if I was going to do it seriously, instead of just like, because I'm trying to make a buck off of an adventure story, it takes work. So, I mean, that's what work is. Work is wanting it so bad and wanting to put that vision forward, that, you know, to represent California like Maya's doing, or to try to represent the future of humanity like what I'm trying to do, or whatever it is. And when you have to write a multiplicity of voices, you have to like kind of shatter yourself and rebuild yourself so that these voices have a space in your own soul. That is hard work. It's hard work that takes a lot of introspection and humility, and the scary realization that you may at some point fuck up, and all of this work will be for naught, and then you will have to, like, you know, publicly do something to fix that, the thing that you did. It is scary work, but it can also be really rewarding work if you do it well.
Here's an interesting question that literally just came in. Is it preferable to write a character in a story who's not from your background, not the main character, and risk getting them wrong, or play it safe and only write characters familiar to you? So this kind of goes back to what we've all learned about write what you know, but of course we want to expand our horizons beyond just what we know.
I think that whole thing, that write characters that are familiar to you, gets at what Mathingy was just saying. The problem is, if no secondary characters of color are familiar to you, then that's a problem with your lifestyle. Like, that's, you need to you need to fix that first.
But I think also when we're talking about background, like your background is so many things, right? So my characters in my books, all the books I have published, not all the books I've written, but all the books that somebody has bought and published so far have taken place in India. And, you know, I think a lot of writers who are from outside of India see them and are like, oh, she's Indian, so she's writing from her experience. But like, I'm not queer, I'm not trans, I'm not poor, I'm not Dalit, I'm not, you know, but somehow for me, writing a brown character who is like one or two identities away from me feels a lot more comfortable to me than writing a Black character, right? And the other thing is, I think the other thing to understand is that the more sort of diverse books you read and the more diverse people you know, characters ring true when there's something human about them. And humanity is something, I mean, this sounds corny, but humanity is something we all have in common, but the ways in which the obstacles we face because of our identities are not, right? So my characters that I write may be different than me in some way, but there's always something about them that's the same. Like maybe somebody is like really stubborn, or maybe my queer character, like I'm you know, I'm a survivor of domestic violence in my family. So sorry, that just got really dark for a second, but it's true. So maybe I'll write a character who has that experience in common with me, but something else that's not. And so there's still some truth to the character that I can distill because there's something familiar about it. So when I write characters that are different than me, I've never written a character that is like completely super different race, sexuality, gender, and everything. I tend to take kind of like baby steps. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Anyone else? So what do you see, where do you see the future of, given the summer of racial reckoning that we had this past summer in particular, which surfaced not only Black Lives Matter, but many marginalized communities' issues and concerns. Where do you see the future of representation going, not just in books, but even in the publication industry? And do you feel optimistic about it or pessimistic about it?
I feel cautiously optimistic. I think the publishing industry, I don't even want to use the word woke up a little bit. Basically, we're nudged and are no longer snoring heavily. Is maybe a better way to put it. And, you know, I think now they're kind of quotaizing to make a new word up. Yeah. So, you know, we've been hearing a lot of like, we need to have more Black writers, we need to have more Asian writers. And in some ways, that numerical need is good in some ways. But the problem is still, and it goes back to something I said earlier, is their perception of those communities, because it's so narrow. And, you know, just because there's going to be maybe twice as many, you know, Black writers being published next year doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to contribute to the wide spectrum of the Black experience. Because they might just be looking for, you know, just certain boxes to check. So it's really concerning. I mean, what we really need is to have a more wide-ranging perspective in, you know, in these organizations that are making the choices.
Yep.
Yeah, I feel optimistic, but I feel like we have to keep fighting. Like we can't. And I don't know, like right before this event, I was reading how the Biden-Harris administration just opened another detention center on the border. And, you know, so many people were surprised by that. And I worked really hard to get Biden elected, but like I had no kind of illusions about how progressive he was not going to be, you know? And I feel like that's how I feel about the publishing industry right now. Like we have an opening, but we still have to keep pushing the door open. So I think there's a lot of great people. I mean, David is probably out of all of us the most visibly doing this work with Dignidad, the Dignidad campaign. But I think all of us in our own ways on this panel, especially, are talk about doing the work, right? Are pushing. So I think this, it feels hopeful to me, but it feels like we have a long way to go and a lot to do.
Yeah, I want to second that. It feels optimistic, but it feels like a lot of the work falls on our own shoulders. And so that's always an upward battle. And so that's why I'm so grateful for this panel, because even though there may have been some uncomfortable or difficult moments, it's really great to have an open forum just to kind of talk about these challenges. And I was at another panel where it was talking about publishers and agents and how they view writers of color. And I couldn't even sit in the panel because it was so demeaning just to hear how agents and publishers think about us. I was like, why am I going to even be in this panel? I mean, so I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm hoping that the work isn't always having to be done by the people who are just trying to get their voices heard.
Yeah, agreed. There is cautious optimism, but at the same time, the incremental nature of the way publishing wants to take this is extremely frustrating and reminds me of, obviously, like a lot of these kinds of things remind me of that great Langston Hughes poem about a dream deferred. And there's a moment, I think, at which we're not going to be able to put up with this any longer. You know, we see, like, so I have several books out from and under contract with Penguin Random House, and they do actually a pretty good job. They have some really good imprints that are focused on, you know, minoritized groups and so forth. I've got a picture book coming out from Coquila the summer in English and in Spanish. But at the same time, Penguin Random House is acquiring Simon & Schuster. So the big five that used to be the big seven are going to be the big four. And you just have this like concentration of more and more power and money and wealth and manipulation of the market in the hands of a small few. And, you know, Lee and Low, an indie minority-owned publisher in New York City that's putting out graphic novel of mine this fall, every year they do this baseline survey taking a look at the identity of people in publishing, and it's still overwhelmingly like more than 80% white, cis, able. The change that needs to happen is painful. If I put in the chat, if like Maya suggests, if we were to double the representation of Black authors next year, that's taking 0.25% of the published books, because that's what Black authors represent, 0.25%, and doubling it to 0.5%. That is not nearly what we need, because Black people make up, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the U.S. population, and real, true representation, true equity it means dismantling the system altogether and coming up with a completely new way. And I've been talking with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and people at the state level and in New York about things like trying to find a quasi antitrust way of addressing the inequities in publishing. And I think that, just like Hollywood as well, they've gotten too big and too powerful and too oppressive to be allowed to continue to exist. And so although I'm cautiously optimistic, I think that it may be that the whole thing needs to be blown up. So I don't know.
I'm actually pessimistic. I feel that we're riding a bump, and I'm just going to be blunt and say that I feel like we can ride the crest of this wave probably for another 6 to 12 months, or until the next person is assassinated by the police. Otherwise, I don't see this as being a bump that will be sustained. And that's primarily because I don't see the publishing industry personnel changing in there. And I'm wondering, how can we get more of us into publishing? That's not an attractive path for us because we don't see enough of us ourselves in there. And also, I'm a little tired at this point of trying to educate the publishing industry about all of the different nuances, that there are. I know very often when I'm pre-COVID, when I'm in meetings with people, I can tell a person who's African from a person who's African American. We do not look the same, but most people cannot tell that difference. And they just assume that everyone there is African American. What about representing not just gender identity differences and not just ethnic identity differences, but life situation differences? If I want to write a book about a character who's adopted, what's my responsibility to make sure I'm writing an authentic narrative from the position of a person who is an adoptee? Or what about people of different religions, or people who are disabled, or are two-spirit or trans, etc.? What are my responsibilities for doing that? And my responsibility, in my mind, is not to the publishing industry to write the characters that they're expecting to see in those skins. My responsibility is to the people who are actually inhabiting those skins. I have to be the sole dissenter. I'm not optimistic that we're going to really see future books peopled with genuine characters that are non-cis and white. Maya?
I think the answer to this is, and this is a dream, but those people in those positions need to recognize the deontological ethic and responsibility of the power they have, and they need to step down. I think that is going to be the only way that this is going to change. Now, I know eventually they could retire and maybe replacements can be made, and that would be kind of a generational shift. But I'm just going to be honest about it. I think that magazine editors, all the way up to the big four, they need to reflect and go, you know what? I have so many blind spots because I possess so much power. I must step down. I mean, I know that that's not popular, and you think, oh, well, they need to make a living too. But no, it's more important to make a life of a culture. And that's a responsibility. So that's my call, is, not in a mean-spirited way, but for them to reflect on it and go, wow, the best way to expedite this is to step down.
Wow. So who's optimistic that that's going to happen? Can I see a show of hands? All right. We're going to get into some juicy comments here. Okay, here is one. This is anonymous. If a writer depicts a non-cis white character in a leading or a strong supporting role, does the writer have to address the challenges someone of a similar background would face in the real world, or can they simply be who they are without addressing the myriad of social, economic, and political problems if those themes are not addressed in the work?
Right. I mean, yeah, obviously it's all fiction is a construct. And so like, you don't have to address every single thing that they could possibly encounter, it's just given the world that you've created, the fictional world you've created, what real life things are likely to come into contact with. So yeah, no, I agree.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. Here's someone who is of Indian origin who has no problem with italicized words from Indian or other languages. Old school perhaps, but I got my vocabulary by reading. If a word like Bobby is thrown in, you wouldn't find it in the dictionary and it leaves the reader confused. More popular ones like chutney have made it into the dictionary, so not italicized.
So for this one, I have to quote David's friend, Daniel Jose Older, who made this great, I don't know if it's a TikTok, is that?
It is
what the
now.
kids are
It was
calling
originally YouTube. It was originally YouTube. Now.
Okay, so you know the video I'm talking about. So he basically made this video showing what that would sound like read aloud, and it's in Spanish. I don't know, Dave, maybe you can do a better job explaining it than me. But
Yeah.
It's basically like, that's how we talk, you know? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, when you're depicting the speech of people who naturally code switch to put words in Italian, I think it's a little bit different when it's part of like third person narrative description or whatever it happens to be. But especially when you're talking about the dialogue of people, or when it's a first person narrative, or even a close third person, italicizing the words is like unnatural and doesn't reflect the way code switching actually works. So that's really well put. But at the same, I will say, publishers have different opinions about this, and there are some publishers who are down with the not italicizing, and others who are like, you're writing my chapter book series 13th Street from HarperCollins. All the characters are Latinx, they're Mexican American cousins, and they do use some Spanish, and they were pretty adamant. They're like, look, this is for early readers. These are kids ages 5 to 9, some of whom are just barely reading chapter books for the first time. And we want to signal to these kids who are not practiced at reading that the word they're looking at is not an English word. And so I was like, all right, I'm not going to fight you on that. I get that. But if I'm writing a YA novel with like a Latinx protagonist and they're code switching, I don't want that to be italicized. So, you fight your battles where you can. And there are some people who feel like it's kind of an overblown issue. But yeah, that's what it boils down to. Especially in the case of Spanish, there's this added, and I think it's true of like any ethnic group, any linguistic ethnic group in the United States. That is not a foreign language because it's spoken by people that live in this country. So, essentially there are no foreign languages because we're a country that doesn't have an official language, and communities are bilingual and trilingual.
Maya made a very radical call at the close of the panel, and here's one from a audience member that says, maybe not with book publishers, but couldn't we boycott journals that have all white editorial boards and are refusing to elevate BIPOC folks to their editorial boards? What do you make of that call?
Yes. We have the power to do that, right? I mean, it's not that we want to attack human beings who are trying to cultivate something beautiful, because I'm sure that those editors are, but they also, because they want to cultivate something beautiful and humane, then they need to understand how they are actually becoming obstacles to that occurring. So yes, I mean, even when I started Foglifter, I was originally on the board, and I stepped down to make room. And we felt, so many of us did in the group, because it was our responsibility to do that. That is serving the arts and letters. That is exactly what we need to be doing. So yay.
I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask one or two questions of one another before we wrap.
I'm interested in what y'all are working on. Carla, Maya, Matangi, sorry. What are y'all writing? What's the new project?
Everybody's quiet because it's pandemic times and none of us are writing. Maybe, sorry, that's my situation. I'm working on a memoir right now, but starting a book revisiting childhood trauma during the pandemic was maybe not the best decision I made. So I've been working on like articles, and I actually got the opportunity just now to write a short story for Denver Noir. So I just wrote my first murder mystery. So that's what I'm on now.
Carla?
I'm working on kind of two things. I've been launching or relaunching my mom's publishing company, Pacific Raven Press. So we just edited a book by Dante Clark, which is super awesome, called Close Caskets. And I am also trying to put together my own collection of poetry called Blood Lies, which I just need to finish and send out. I have all these back projects.
Okay. And Maya, I know you have a book upcoming. Anything else?
Yeah, next week is the launch of Home is Where You Queer Your Heart, which is an anthology that I co-edited with Arisa White, the poet, and Monique Marrow Williams. And the project I'm working on is called Summer of the Locusts, and it takes place in a West Virginia trailer park, and it's actually a way for me to try to understand the Trump supporter. So it's really looking at whiteness as an oppressive construct among a group of people that don't necessarily identify it. So I'm trying to empathize with those characters as a way to just kind of broaden my understanding of, the American landscape.
Okay. All right. I am going to toss it back to Shuffle for our close.
Thank you, Lizette, and thank you everyone so much. Carla, Maya, Matangi, David, thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights and thoughts. I came across this quote by Arundhati Roy that I thought really summed up a lot of the discussion today. So I wanted to take a second to read that. A good or great writer may refuse to accept any responsibility or morality that society wishes to impose on her. Yet the best and the greatest of them know that if they abuse this hard-won freedom, it can only lead to bad art. With that, I want to thank all the attendees for being here. And I know we went over our time, so appreciate all the flexibility and patience that people have had. If you want to, please look up all of these amazing writers and follow their work. And if you want to join in more such conversations and events, do check out Shuffle Collective. I'll put out the link there, and we'll add in a special discount for anyone who applies quoting this event. So thank you so much. And Lisa, did you want to add anything as well?
Yes, a very big thank you to all of our panelists. This was really enlightening, and thank you for all your different views. I feel like I learned a lot. Would love to talk to all of you more. And I neglected to say at the beginning that California Writers Club is one of the oldest writers clubs in the nation. We have 22 branches up and down the state in California. However, everything is virtual for now, probably for the rest of the year at least. And we welcome all writers. Our motto is Writers Helping Writers. So we're very proud to be a co-sponsor of this event and have all these writers here tonight. So I put the link to CWC in the chat, and just thank you so much to all our panelists and to everyone who is here tonight and stayed a little bit of extra time for this conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.